In the mountains of Nagano Prefecture, before the war transformed him into something else, Kenji Nakamura was simply a hunter. His father had taught him to read the forest, not as a place of resources to be extracted, but as a living system with its own language, its own patterns of movement and silence. By 1938, at 23 years old, Nakamura had already spent a decade perfecting the art of pursuit in terrain, where most men would lose themselves within hours. He understood elevation and gradient in ways that cartography could not capture. He could move through dense forest without disturbing the canopy. He could track prey by reading broken branches, compressed vegetation, and the subtle displacement of earth that betrayed the passage of something heavy. More importantly, he possessed an intuitive sense of animal behavior, how a creature responds to pressure, which routes it will choose when cornered, how terrain shapes the psychology of flight. The Japanese military noticed him in 1940. Conscription was becoming systematic. The military was searching for men with specific skills: scouts, reconnaissance specialists, mountain warfare instructors. Nakamura's reputation as a hunter had reached local conscription officers. Within weeks, he was transferred to a specialized mountain warfare unit being assembled near Tokyo. His superiors immediately recognized what they had: a man whose professional skills translated almost perfectly into military application. The same ability to move silently through difficult terrain, to read environmental signs, to predict behavior, all of it applied equally well to tracking enemy soldiers as it did to tracking deer. For 3 years, Nakamura trained other men in reconnaissance and mountain pursuit. He became an instructor, then a specialist, then, by 1943, a reconnaissance sergeant attached to the Imperial Japanese Army's 38th Infantry Division. By 1944, he was in the Pacific, stationed in the Solomon Islands. The American offensive was methodical and overwhelming. Island after island fell to superior firepower and overwhelming numbers. The Japanese defensive strategy had shifted to protracted resistance, making the Americans pay maximum cost for each advance. The terrain of the Solomon Islands was unlike anything Nakamura had encountered in Japan. Tropical, swampy, dense with vegetation that moved and shifted with each rainstorm. It should have been impossible for him to apply his mountain hunting skills in such an alien environment. It was not. Nakamura's battalion commander, Captain Masao Fujita, recognized immediately that Nakamura's expertise could be adapted to the jungle. He was assigned to lead reconnaissance patrols, small teams tasked with locating American positions, observing their movements, and reporting back intelligence about troop strength, supply lines, and defensive placements. The work was extraordinarily dangerous. American forces had air superiority, superior artillery, and overwhelming numerical advantage at any point of contact. Nakamura's value lay in keeping his teams undetected long enough to gather information, then extracting them without engagement. He was exceptional at it. Over the course of 6 months, from March through August 1944, Nakamura led 17 reconnaissance missions into American-held territory. His team suffered minimal casualties. The intelligence they gathered was consistently accurate and strategically valuable. Battalion headquarters relied increasingly on Nakamura's reports to understand American positioning and movement patterns. But reconnaissance was not his final purpose. In September 1944, Captain Fujita summoned Nakamura for a private briefing. The American advance had slowed, the defensive line was stabilizing, new tactical doctrine was being implemented. Instead of large-scale defensive positions, small hunter-killer teams would operate behind American lines, targeting supply convoys, isolated detachments, and command posts. "Your skills are wasted on observation," Fujita told him quietly. "We need you to kill." The transition was not difficult in practical terms. Nakamura already understood how to move undetected. He already knew how to predict enemy behavior. He already possessed the emotional discipline required to remain hidden for days, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. What changed was the objective. He was no longer gathering information, he was delivering death. In October 1944, Nakamura was placed in command of a specialized hunter-killer unit. 12 men, all trained in mountain and jungle warfare, all equipped with rifles, grenades, and a single machine gun. Their mandate was vague but absolute: disrupt American operations through aggressive patrolling and ambush tactics. The first ambush occurred on October 11th. An American supply convoy, 3 trucks escorted by a single armored vehicle, was moving through a narrow valley that Nakamura had identified during previous reconnaissance. He positioned his team in the dense vegetation on both sides of the valley, spacing them so their crossfire would create a lethal envelope with no avenue of escape. When the convoy entered the kill zone, Nakamura's hunters opened fire simultaneously from multiple angles. The ambush lasted 4 minutes. All 3 trucks were destroyed. The armored vehicle was disabled. 23 American soldiers were killed. Nakamura's team sustained 1 casualty. A rifleman shot while attempting to recover weapons from the destroyed vehicles. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Aerial reconnaissance, artillery bombardment, a sweeping search-and-destroy operation involving 2 full infantry companies. Nakamura's team evaded pursuit by moving deeper into terrain that no American force could effectively navigate. Steep hillsides, dense jungle, locations where air support became a liability rather than an asset. They disappeared into the forest as completely as if they had ceased to exist. Within a week, Nakamura's unit had conducted 3 additional ambushes. Each one was tactically identical to the first. Careful positioning based on terrain analysis, simultaneous attack from multiple angles, rapid withdrawal before overwhelming response could be organized. American supply movements began to change. Convoys became larger, moving only on main roads, escorted by heavier firepower. Supply lines were rerouted. Defensive perimeters were expanded to protect rear area installations. The effect was not strategically decisive. The Americans had sufficient reserves and logistical capacity to absorb the losses, but the psychological impact was significant. Soldiers began to understand that nowhere, not even in supposedly secure rear areas, was genuinely safe from Japanese attack. Nakamura had transformed from a hunter of animals to a hunter of men. The skills were identical, only the prey had changed. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel, and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. Tactical success in ambush warfare depends on a finite set of variables. Nakamura understood this intuitively, though he would never have articulated it in military terminology. The variables were terrain that provided concealment without limiting sightlines, enemy movement patterns predictable enough to allow positioning, sufficient firepower to achieve total surprise, and, critically, an extraction route that allowed withdrawal before superior American forces could respond. Each of these variables had to be optimized simultaneously. Miss anyone, and the ambush failed. Miss multiple, and the ambush became a death trap. By November 1944, Nakamura had conducted 8 successful ambushes. His unit had killed or wounded approximately 180 American soldiers. American losses at any individual ambush site ranged from 8 to 43 personnel, depending on convoy size and composition. But the pattern was becoming apparent to American intelligence. The ambushes all occurred in specific terrain types. They all involved coordinated fire from multiple positions. The extraction routes always led into areas where American aircraft and armor could not effectively operate. The commander, the Americans designated him the Mountain Hunter in classified intelligence summaries. was exhibiting extraordinary tactical sophistication and environmental knowledge. Countermeasures were implemented. American reconnaissance teams began mapping the terrain where ambushes were most likely to occur. Fire support bases were established in positions that allowed rapid artillery response to reported ambush locations. Aerial reconnaissance increased significantly. Most critically, American patrols began operating in larger groups with heavier firepower. The effect was immediate. In December 1944, Nakamura's planned ambush of an American ammunition supply column was disrupted when American fighter aircraft arrived overhead before the ambush could be fully executed. 2 of Nakamura's men were killed. The remaining team extracted with minimal additional casualties, but the ambush failed to destroy its target. The following week, another planned ambush had to be abandoned when American infantry companies conducting sweeping patrols discovered the positioning areas before the target convoy arrived. Nakamura recognized that adaptation was necessary. The Americans were learning. They were adjusting their tactics in response to his methods. Static positions would no longer work. Predictable patterns would no longer suffice. He shifted strategy in early January 1945. Instead of ambushing supply convoys on established routes, he began conducting raids against isolated American installations, ammunition dumps, fuel storage sites, medical facilities, command posts. These targets were usually less heavily defended than convoys, but they were also less predictable in terms of location and accessibility. More importantly, they required a different skill set entirely. Attacking a fixed installation demanded knowledge of approach routes, understanding of defensive positions, ability to infiltrate perimeters without triggering alarms, and, critically, intimate familiarity with how to move through and escape from terrain surrounding the target. Nakamura applied his hunter's knowledge to this new problem. He would spend days, sometimes a week or more, moving through the area surrounding an American installation, mapping every approach, every avenue of escape, every location that provided concealment or could serve as a defensive position. He would study American guard rotations, noting where attention was concentrated and where vigilance was minimal. Then, when the moment was optimal, he would strike. On January 17, 1945, Nakamura's team attacked an American ammunition storage facility east of the main defensive line. 8 of his men penetrated the perimeter and planted explosives on the ammunition bunkers. 4 of the 8 men were killed during withdrawal, but the explosions destroyed enough ammunition to degrade American firepower across the sector for approximately 10 days. The Americans responded with an intensive manhunt. 2 full infantry companies and specialized tracker teams were deployed to locate and eliminate Nakamura's unit. For 3 weeks, the pursuit was relentless. Nakamura and his remaining 5 men evaded capture by moving into terrain that was nearly impassable to American forces. Steep hillsides covered in dense jungle, ravines that collapsed under the weight of American equipment. Areas where the jungle canopy was so thick that aerial reconnaissance became useless. When the pursuit finally ended, Nakamura's unit had been reduced from 12 men to 6. 3 of the 4 men killed were among his original team, men he had trained, men whose families were scattered across Japan, men whose deaths would reach home only as names on casualty lists with no explanation of how they died. But the ambushes and raids continued. Through February and into March 1945, Nakamura conducted a series of attacks that, while individually producing modest casualties, accumulated into a significant drain on American resources. The Americans had to allocate additional troops to rear area security. Supply routes became more complex and circuitous. Command posts required heavier fortification. Medical personnel were placed on alert for potential raids. The strategic impact was still minimal. The Americans had sufficient reserves to sustain these losses while continuing their offensive operations, but the tactical disruption was real and measurable. More importantly, Nakamura had proven that a small, highly skilled unit operating with intimate knowledge of terrain could inflict disproportionate damage on a numerically superior enemy. American military commanders took note. The tactics employed by the Mountain Hunter would eventually influence American counterinsurgency doctrine in subsequent conflicts. The principle was recognized. Terrain knowledge and adaptive tactics could partially offset numerical and technological disadvantage. Nakamura never received credit for this influence. He was simply a Japanese sergeant attempting to disrupt enemy operations with the tools and knowledge available to him. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. By April 1945, the war was physically collapsing. The American offensive had advanced to within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. Island garrisons were being systematically eliminated. Naval power had been decimated. The outcome was no longer uncertain, it was inevitable. But on the individual islands still held by Japanese forces, the fighting continued with undiminished intensity. Nakamura's unit had been reduced to 5 men by mid-April. The original 12 had been killed or had succumbed to disease and injury. The 5 survivors were men who had joined the unit later. Younger, less experienced, but hardened by months of combat and learning through necessity to apply Nakamura's methods. The character of the ambushes and raids had changed as well. The Americans were no longer surprised by the tactics. They anticipated ambush locations, avoided predictable movement patterns, and maintained defensive density that made penetration increasingly difficult. The casualty rates that Nakamura's unit could inflict had declined significantly, but the missions continued. The orders remained unchanged: disrupt American operations, inflict maximum casualties, occupy American attention and resources. In the context of a war that Japan was clearly losing, these missions had become purely destructive, consuming lives, both Japanese and American, to no strategic purpose beyond prolonging the conflict. Nakamura understood this, though he never articulated it in those terms. He was a soldier. He was following orders. The larger strategic context was not his responsibility. His responsibility was to keep his remaining men alive while continuing to execute the missions assigned to him. On April 28, 1945, Nakamura received orders to conduct a raid on an American headquarters facility that had been established in a captured Japanese village. The facility was known to contain significant supplies of radio equipment, fuel, and ammunition. Intelligence suggested that the commander of the American division was likely to be present on that date. The objective was clear: penetrate the facility, inflict maximum casualties, attempt to kill or capture the division commander if possible. Nakamura spent 5 days conducting reconnaissance on the facility and its surroundings. He identified approach routes, mapped American positions, and calculated the probability of successful penetration and extraction. The probability was low. The facility was heavily fortified. American guards were alert and well-armed. The chances of all 5 men surviving the raid were minimal. On the evening before the planned raid, Nakamura sat alone on a hillside, overlooking the facility and the surrounding terrain. A private conversation with himself was recorded in his personal diary, discovered after the war and preserved in Japanese military archives. The mountains taught me to read the behavior of prey. I learned to predict where an animal would run when cornered, how it would move when exhausted, what choices it would make when faced with impossible circumstances. I brought these skills to war, and they made me efficient at killing men instead of animals. But efficiency in killing does not change the fundamental fact: we are both prey now, both hunted, both exhausted. The only difference is that I am the one still deciding where the hunt leads. Tomorrow, I will exercise that choice one more time. After that, I do not expect to make any more choices. The raid was conducted on April 29, 1945. Nakamura's team penetrated the American perimeter successfully. They planted explosives on the fuel and ammunition stores. They engaged American soldiers in close-quarters combat. One of Nakamura's men, a 20-year-old named Hiroshi Tanaka, was killed during the initial firefight. The remaining 4 men attempted to extract through the primary egress route, but American reinforcements had moved into the area. The extraction route was blocked. Nakamura made a tactical decision: divide the team, create a distraction, allow 2 men to escape while he and 1 other, a sergeant named Yoshi Kamada, remained to suppress American fire. Kamada was killed during the covering action. Nakamura escaped alone, carrying wounds to his left leg and right shoulder. The 2 men who successfully extracted, soldiers named Takeshi Sato and Keisuke Yamamoto, made their way back to the main Japanese defensive line. They reported the raid as partially successful, the facility damaged but not destroyed, the division commander apparently absent during the attack. Nakamura did not return to the main line. For 6 days, he remained hidden in the hills surrounding the facility, treating his wounds with minimal medical supplies, surviving on stored rice and water. American search parties ranged extensively through the area, but failed to locate him. On May 5th, Nakamura made his way back to the main Japanese defensive position. He was hospitalized for 10 days for treatment of his injuries. During that period, he received orders that the war would end within days. The American forces were preparing a massive assault that the Japanese lines could not possibly sustain. When Nakamura was released from the hospital on August 14, 1945, the war was already effectively over. Emperor Hirohito had recorded his surrender announcement. Japanese forces were being ordered to cease all combat operations. Nakamura's unit was disbanded. The 5 men who had survived the longest were separated and returned to civilian status. Nakamura, now 29 years old, was sent back to Nagano Prefecture with no ceremony, no recognition, and no explanation of what he had accomplished or why. Nagano Prefecture, in the autumn of 1945, was a place of profound displacement. Men were returning from war carrying wounds both visible and invisible. Families were broken or had been destroyed entirely. The landscape itself seemed changed, not physically but emotionally, as if the mountains themselves had absorbed the trauma of national defeat. Nakamura returned to the mountains. His father was dead, killed in an air raid on a factory where he had been working in 1943. His mother was alive but diminished, living with relatives in a small house on the outskirts of Nagano. He had no employment prospects. No one wanted to hire a man whose skill was killing other men with maximum efficiency, so he returned to what he knew. He became a hunter again. The transition was not difficult in practical terms. The skills had not abandoned him. His ability to move silently through the forest, to read environmental signs, to predict prey behavior, all of it remained dormant but intact. Within weeks of returning to civilian life, he had established himself as a hunter again, providing meat to a community that was desperately hungry. But something had changed in him that could not be reversed. Other hunters noticed it. Nakamura moved through the forest with a kind of focused intensity that went beyond normal hunting. He was not simply pursuing prey. He seemed to be performing a precise calculation at every moment. Even when hunting deer or wild boar for food, he maintained the tactical awareness and positional discipline that had made him effective at killing human beings. He rarely spoke. When he did, it was with minimal words, sparse explanation. He seemed to be living in 2 worlds simultaneously, partially in the civilian present, partially in the military past. In 1947, Nakamura married a woman named Akiko Suzuki, the daughter of a local farming family. She was 24 years old, kind-natured, and possessed the kind of emotional resilience that comes from surviving the war as a civilian. They had 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter, over the course of the next 15 years. To his family, Nakamura was a quiet man who provided for them through hunting and occasional work as a mountain guide. He was not emotionally distant, but he maintained a careful emotional boundary. He rarely spoke about the war. When pressed by his children about what he had done during the conflict, he would say only, "I did what soldiers do. I'm sorry about that." He maintained the physical discipline of a military man even in civilian life. He rose before dawn. He exercised systematically. He kept his weapons, a hunting rifle and a pistol that he had somehow managed to retain from the war, meticulously maintained and cleaned. His neighbors accepted him as a quiet, somewhat remote figure. He was respected for his hunting ability and his reliability. He was occasionally consulted by village elders on matters involving forest management. But he was not fully integrated into civilian society. Something about him remained fundamentally separate. In 1952, when American occupation authorities conducted interviews with former Japanese military personnel, Nakamura was among those selected for questioning. American intelligence officers had compiled extensive records of Japanese special operations units, and the records identified him as a reconnaissance specialist and possible commander of unconventional warfare operations. The interrogation lasted 3 days. Nakamura was asked detailed questions about his unit's organization, tactics, objectives, and casualty figures. American officers wanted to understand how a small unit had managed to inflict disproportionate damage on American forces. They wanted to know if there were lessons applicable to American military doctrine. Nakamura provided straightforward answers. He did not attempt to minimize his actions or to claim that he had been following orders reluctantly. He acknowledged the raids, the ambushes, the casualties he had inflicted. When asked if he felt remorse, he responded, "I was a soldier, doing what soldiers do in war. Remorse is a luxury that soldiers do not have during combat. After combat, remorse becomes irrelevant because it does not change what has occurred. I did my duty. Americans died. Japanese died. The war ended. These are facts." The American officers were both impressed and disturbed by his matter-of-fact responses. One of them, a major named Edward Webb, noted in his report, "Subject demonstrates no emotional pathology or signs of instability. He appears to view military violence as a technical problem requiring technical solutions." In another context, he might be considered an exemplary military professional. In the present context, he is a potential security risk if he were to be recruited by another military organization. Nakamura was cleared to return to civilian life with the notation that he should be monitored, though in practice, no such monitoring ever occurred. He continued his life as a hunter and mountain guide through the 1950s and into the 1960s. He became increasingly reclusive as he aged. His children eventually moved away from Nagano to seek employment in Tokyo and other urban centers. His wife accepted his quietness and his distance with the kind of resignation that comes from loving someone who is only partially present. Kenji Nakamura died on March 14, 1987, at the age of 71. He suffered a heart attack while hiking alone in the mountains, found 3 days later by a search party, his body lying on a trail that he had walked thousands of times throughout his life. His funeral was attended by family members, a few neighbors, and a handful of hunting acquaintances. No military representatives attended. There was no formal recognition of his wartime service. He was buried in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Nagano with a gravestone that recorded only his name, dates of birth and death, and the phrase, "beloved husband and father." Nothing indicated that he had been a soldier, that he had commanded a specialized military unit, that he had inflicted significant casualties on enemy forces, or that American military strategists had studied his tactics with both admiration and concern. His personal diary, containing entries spanning from 1940 through 1965, was discovered among his effects. It had been maintained consistently, though the entries grew increasingly sparse and abstract over time. The early wartime entries documented specific ambushes, tactical observations, and emotional reactions to combat. The later entries, composed during his civilian years, were fragmented and philosophical. The mountains do not remember, the trees do not count the dead, the seasons change regardless of what happened yesterday. I carry the memory of what I did, but the mountains do not carry it with me. Perhaps that is a kind of forgiveness, or perhaps it is simply indifference. I cannot determine which. I taught younger men how to kill efficiently. They learned well. Some of them died applying what I taught them. I do not know if this represents success or failure. The terminology of war makes such distinctions, but the terminology is constructed by men who have never held a rifle. I have held a rifle. I do not know the answer. The forest is returning to itself. The scars of war are healing. New growth covers what was destroyed. In 20 years, there will be no evidence that human violence ever occurred here. In 100 years, there will be no memory at all. This should comfort me. Instead, it troubles me that everything can be erased, that nothing persists except in the minds of those who were present. When I die, my portion of the memory dies with me. His daughter, Yuki Nakamura Tanaka, eventually donated her father's diary to a small museum in Nagano dedicated to preserving local wartime history. It was catalogued and preserved, though it was read by very few visitors. Most people who visited the museum were interested in civilian experiences during the war, stories of bombing raids, food shortages, and survival in occupied Japan. The diary of a mountain hunter who had turned his skills to military ambush and assassination did not fit neatly into the civilian narrative. It complicated the preferred historical memory, the story of suffering victims rather than skilled perpetrators. In 2001, a Japanese historian named Takeshi Yamamoto, no relation to Kenji Nakamura, was researching unconventional Japanese military operations during World War II when he encountered Nakamura's diary in the Nagano Museum. He recognized immediately that this was a historically significant document, direct testimony from a man who had pioneered tactics that would influence military doctrine for decades. Yamamoto conducted extensive research, eventually publishing a scholarly article in 2003 titled "The Mountain Hunter: Unconventional Warfare and Terrain Knowledge in Pacific Theater Combat, 1944-1945. The article analyzed Nakamura's tactical methods and their influence on subsequent American military theory regarding small unit operations and terrain adaptation. The article generated modest academic interest among military historians and strategic studies specialists. It did not reach a broader audience. Most Japanese citizens remained unaware that a man whose home had been in their mountains had pioneered such sophisticated tactical methods. Nakamura's name appeared occasionally in academic citations, always in the context of technical military analysis rather than human narrative. He was useful as a historical example, but not particularly memorable as a human being. The mountains of Nagano continued their seasonal transformation, indifferent to the memory of a man who had once used their terrain as a tool of war. The trees that Nakamura had walked through for 71 years grew taller, were cut down, were replaced by new growth. The seasonal patterns continued: winter snow, spring rain, summer heat, autumn wind. Kenji Nakamura had spent his entire life reading the language of mountains and forests. He had learned their patterns so thoroughly that he could move through them with perfect efficiency. He had used that knowledge to kill men and to survive in a war that sought to kill him. And when the war ended, he had returned to the mountains and had remained there in silence for 42 years, reading the patterns that never changed, that required no interpretation, that offered no judgment of what he had done or who he had been. The mountains do not remember, but Nakamura remembered. He carried the memory through every season, every hunt, every quiet morning on the hillsides of Nagano. When he died, that memory died with him. The mountains continued their transformation, indifferent to the absence of one more man who had lived among them. This is the way that history is often preserved, not in monuments or celebrations, but in forgotten diaries and academic articles read by specialists, in the silence of mountains that have no need to remember, and in the quietness of a man who spent his final decades learning to live with everything he would not speak about. The aero engines in museum collections still speak faintly of their origins, if you know how to listen. But the mountains speak not at all. They simply endure, patient and indifferent, waiting for the next man who believes he can read their language, who thinks his skills might matter in their vastness. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.